Good morning. I'm MassTLC CEO Tom Hopcroft, and I'd like to welcome you to today's session. Today we're talking about valuing neurodiversity in the tech industry, understanding this vital community. Our people in tech are our most important assets, and mental health is a concern even in the best of times. Given the importance of this issue, MassTLC has teamed with the MindWise Innovations to put together this four-part series on mental health in technology. Today's topic is so important as our companies are working harder than ever on building diverse teams and identifying potential hires for the unique value that they bring. I'd like to, as we get started, first thank our global sponsors. These companies help us throughout the year. They provide their time and their treasure and their thought leadership and are really key to a lot of the work that we're able to do here at MassTLC. Now, today's session is the third in our series on behavioral health. For those of you who missed the prior sessions, you can find the recordings at masstlc.org. And I'd like to invite you to come back next week and join us as we continue the conversation. Also, MindWise Innovations has put together an amazing offer for MassTLC members to receive a free consultation. Lisa Desai from MindWise will tell you more about that in just a few moments. And now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Aaron Lurch from MindWise to review a few of the housekeeping items, introduce our guests, and get into the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning, everyone. My name is Aaron Lurch. I'm part of the MindWise Innovations team. MindWise provides a suite of digital solutions and consultative services that allow corporations, states, and universities to understand the unique behavioral health needs of their organization. MindWise is powered by Riverside Community Care, a nonprofit leader in behavioral health and human services. Before we get started, I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is going to be about 60 minutes long. It's primarily a panel discussion with our three presenters, so please feel free to submit questions at any time via the Q&A function, which you can locate on the bottom of your Zoom window. Please note that your submitted questions may be seen by other attendees with your name attached. If you would prefer to ask your question anonymously, that option is available in the Q&A box. Your audio and video have been automatically disabled for this webinar, so there's no need to worry about being heard or seen during the presentation. As Tom mentioned, after the webinar is over, the recording will be available through MassTLC's website, and we'll be emailing a link to view it to everyone who registered for today's webinar. Please feel free to share that with others who may be interested. And now I'm excited to introduce our presenters, starting with our three panelists. The first of our three panelists today is Dan Tater. Dan is the founder and CEO of ADK Group, a Boston-based software and digital product development company. As the leader of ADK, Dan oversees both the company's equity portfolio of startup companies and ADK's service business. Dan spends much of his time working in the digital health space. He's also the founder of ADK Charities, a 501c3 organization which operates behind the scenes to provide support and funding to charitable fundraising efforts. Also joining us today is Leslie O'Brien. Leslie's been with MGH Aspire since 2012 and has developed and directs MGH Aspire Works and its employer training and consulting programs. In addition to individual consulting with supervisors and employees, MGH Aspire Works programs provide over 50 area employers with carefully matched neurodiverse interns and the mentorship that leads to success. She aims to empower and help neurodiverse employees and candidates increase their knowledge, self-confidence, and professional work experience. And our third presenter today is Sydney Gregory. Sydney has been an employee at Red Hat for 2 years, where she serves as North American Chair for the Neurodiversity community. She's ecstatic to be part of a community that promotes caring for each other and expressing empathy. It is her dream that all people will be able to bring all parts of themselves to the workplace. She's had depression and anxiety while working in places where you could not speak up and knows how hard it can be. She's passionate about reducing stigma, active listening, and creating psychological safety. And last, but certainly not least, is Lisa Desai, who's our moderator for today's panel. Lisa is the Director of Behavioral Health Consulting here at MindWise. She leads the development of new screening tools and innovative programs with the goal of reaching underserved populations. She's been a practicing licensed psychologist for 25 years, providing behavioral health services to youth, adults, and families. And now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Lisa to kick us off.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us. I am truly excited to be part of this discussion today, to have Dan, Sydney, and Leslie with us to talk about a very overlooked topic, neurodiversity, and what that means, and how we really need to think about what diversity in every form can bring to the workplace. So we're going to start right off with the poll for each of you to answer. How familiar are you with neurodiversity? Very familiar, somewhat familiar, a little familiar, or not at all familiar? So please just take a moment to complete the poll.
Okay, looks like we've got most folks responding, so I'm going to go ahead and share those results.
Okay. So as I'll be doing throughout today's discussion, would love to hear from our panelists regarding this outcome and what surprises you or doesn't about this. Oh, I hope everyone is unmuted. So it's great to see that there's quite a bit of familiarity with neurodiversity, which is fantastic. So I will then, unless there are any comments or questions regarding that, I will move on. So a quick overview of what neurodiversity means, and what I've been learning as I've been thinking about this topic is that more and more the term that is used, and I think makes a lot of sense, is differently abled, which really speaks to all of us in ways that we don't fit necessarily in any particular mold. So it's a much more broad way of thinking about this. So neurodiversity refers to neurological differences and that they're recognized in ways that any variation in individuality is recognized. So less of a negative connotation that perhaps has been in the past. In the context of the workplace and diversity inclusion or diversity conversations, and for purposes of this conversation, we'll think about neurodiversity in terms of autism, excuse me, autism spectrum, Asperger's, ADD, dyslexia, dyspraxia. And I mention that because the definition and description of neurodiversity can be very broad, some including anxiety and depression as well. Again, for purposes of this conversation, we'll talk about it in the workplace context that I just described. Very important to think about neurodiversity from a strength-based approach, and very much in terms of where our panelists are coming from, in thinking about how do we recognize the capabilities and maximize opportunities, as well as recognize the benefits for not only employers and companies, but also coworkers that are working with those that identify or bring neurodiversity to a team or an organization. So would like to start off with a question. So this is for the panelists. What are common stereotypes and falsehoods about neurodiversity? Sydney, I know yesterday if you want to kick it off, you had mentioned a few, if you'd like to speak to this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lisa. I think that common stereotypes and falsehoods refer to people typically think neurodiversity only refers to persons on the autism spectrum, which is just not the case. It's a biological fact that can imply or mean many different types of people, as we just saw in our definition for this webinar. I think one of the things that comes to mind when I think about stereotypes is I think that we see in popular culture, especially in the media, that different types of abilities are displayed with certain behaviors and actions that are sort of less than flattering, right? Most of the time, they're a little bit inaccurate, a lot inaccurate, such as ADHD persons always being hyperactive or autistic persons being these geniuses, like the Rain Man kind of idea. And these can be really damaging to promoting an empathetic response. It allows people to connect with this falsehood as opposed to a real person who has a whole wealth of experience and a whole range of of conditions and factors that make them special and unique. So that's kind of what comes to mind when I think about this question.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sydney. Dan, Leslie, any other thoughts about stereotypes that come to mind around neurodiversity or that you encounter?
I think just to echo a little bit of what Sydney said, you know, there's this expectation that if your background or your diagnosis is one thing, that you only fit into this one category. And it's just so variable, dependent on your skill set and your strengths and your abilities. And I think that oftentimes when I'm talking to a group of people, they're like, oh, what's the magic words? What's the magic thing that we can do for this particular type of learning style? And I said, well, actually, it's a variety of learning styles. And actually, it's one size does not fit all. And you'd have to figure out how best to support that individual person and what they bring to the table. So really recognizing that it is completely individualized, but that's such a benefit as well.
I'll hit this from a different angle. I think that some people might think that having neurodiversity within your company might be something that is almost an effort to do good or almost charitable or philanthropic, falls into that category within your company, when in reality, it is something that really props your company and enhances your company and can really be something that drives performance in your company as well. So I think it's very easy for businesses to kind of put this into the wrong category as something that's more of a, we're giving up something to build a neurodiverse workforce, where in fact you're gaining something by building that workforce.
That is such an important point. Thank you, Dan, for sharing that. I came across a little bit of outcome data of organizations that do now have practice, maybe for 2 or 3 years, hiring those that identify as neurodiverse. And it was interesting that those that are neurotypical members of the team reported increased morale and meaningfulness in their work as a result of working alongside those that are deemed or identified as neurodiverse. So very much to your point. Thank you for that. So another poll for all of you: how much experience do you have working with a neurodiverse colleague?
You should see the poll on your screens now. We'll just leave it up for a few seconds so we can get some responses.
Thank you, Erin.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it looks like we've got most folks.
Great. Oh, okay. Yeah, so thoughts about this?
I feel like it's a trick question, which I love, because there's neurodiversity probably on every team, and just recognizing that we think and learn differently, and that's what makes it so rich. I think to Dan's point, that it really ignites or empowers the team to have this diverse thinking. And if you look at the teams that you're on, whether or not somebody comes out and says, hey, this is my learning profile, or this is how I think, or this is how I take in information, there's certainly diversity that's there, whether or not it's explicitly stated. So I think a lot of people would be surprised, and I appreciate the option of I'm not sure, because typically it can be hidden for many people, and for others not as much.
That's right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Leslie. I'm a little technical with here we go. So to that point, Accenture with the AAPD did a study in 2018 looking at 140 companies and found that those that are most inclusive for workers and for disabled employees achieved an average of 28% higher revenue. I mention this because I think when companies are looking to employ and diversify the workplace, we all know that hopefully it comes from a place of wanting to do the right thing and wanting to really think about how to create the most kind of human-rich environment for workers. But we also know that people that it's important to look at how is this actually impacting productivity in the work. So I think this is a very important finding. I just want to say that I did the disabled that way because we work with Healthy Minds Philly very closely. And I love that their Department of Disabilities uses a small d and a capital A. So I've adopted that moving forward. And again, you know, it's interesting that 1 in 8 people consider themselves neurodiverse, and 50% of that may know that, may be aware of that, or identify that way. So many of those that are coming into the organizations, Leslie, to your point, very well may not identify or feel comfortable doing so. So what does it mean? This is for the 3 of you. What does it mean to have a neurodiverse workforce? What does that mean from your perspectives? Broad question.
I think I can speak to this one. At Red Hat, we currently, we're working on it, but we don't have any way to measure the amount of neurodiverse persons in our workforce. And so I think in order to be able to say you have a neurodiverse workforce, I think measurability is something that's pretty key. Self-identification is what it is. It's going to be as reliable as it can be, but if you have no data to go off of, I think that's something that it's kind of been a growth curve for us, and hopefully that's helpful to somebody on the call.
Yep. Great. And is there a sense of a trend, and Leslie, given the work that you do, a trend of workforces becoming more neurodiverse or paying closer attention to that?
It's interesting to see how many, some companies that know about even this term exists and others that are not aware, or what the umbrella term of neurodiversity really refers to. And I think, to me, what a neurodiverse workforce really is an inclusive workforce that really highlights the strengths and capabilities of the members of the team. And so recognizing that we think and learn differently, but with that strength base, the whole concept of neurodiversity is, instead of looking at the deficits, which is originally the whole idea of, okay, let's, you're noticing that people have different backgrounds, different diagnoses, different, whether or not they come forward with that. I think having a neurodiverse workforce means that you are looking to, or have created, a more inclusive environment to really highlight the strengths of the different minds and different ways of thinking that you have on your team. And so you're choosing to really embed that into your values and your mission to be able to support people however they need to work, to be empowered to do so.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. Is there ever, does it ever feel to employers when they're thinking in terms of inclusivity, and more, I think as there's a sense of we really need to expand the range of what that is, I wonder if employers sometimes shy away because it feels that it's too much to tackle.
I think having a neurodiverse workforce, and whether you're measuring it or not, I think it just shows something about the overall culture of your company and who your company is. I think that it shows a progressive company that, and to where, use the word tackle, if it shows a company that is starving for knowledge and growth and the ability to learn and work with different types of people. So I kind of think it's an overall statement as an employer about your company. I think lots of things are hard work to do well. And from our experience, becoming a more diverse workforce, that's something that is hard work to do well. But if you have the right team and the right people up and down the organization, it's something that is, very manageable and people will be excited about.
Fantastic, thank you. Thanks to all of you. So this, Leslie, your comments actually were not kind of planted. It rolls perfectly into this. When we think about inclusive environment, it really does strike me that it includes all of this kind of psychological safety, which Sydney, I know, and something that you'd shared with me a few days ago, you mentioned psychological safety, so very much that aspect. Physical spaces, how to make physical spaces more inclusive, hiring practices to create opportunity, the role of leadership and the role of team members, so that it does not fall completely on leadership in a sense, but it's really a commitment throughout the organization. So as we now move into Dan, Leslie, Sydney, you each having an opportunity to talk about your work, what kind of led to your work and what you were finding in the course of your work, I imagine that we'll be touching on various aspects of this. So, so Dan will talk from the perspective of being a founder, a leadership position, an employer. Dan actually has been working, I think, for a while with Aspire and introduced us to Leslie and the work that Leslie does. So then Leslie will speak a bit about that piece, about recruitment, talent hiring, and I imagine the trend around how to build kind of recruitment differently in terms of a model so that you're really casting a wide net. And then Sydney will be speaking from the perspective of really the power of employee groups, such as ERG or DI groups that focus on neurodiversity. So to get us started, Dan, would love to hear from you. What led you to take action in creating a neurodiverse workforce for your company?
Sure. So starting personal, I'm one of two siblings, and my brother's on the autism spectrum. And so my whole life, I've, had the opportunity to live in a neurodiverse household to some extent, if that's a term, and have some amount of experience with different types of people. I think in tech, you're always looking for how do you make yourself special. It's been the last 5 years such a competitive market to hire talent, to retain talent, to do something different and special. And I think a part of our when you look at our company, a part of our kind of DNA and makeup and what's going to make us unique and a place where people can grow and learn and be a really fun place to work was a part of starting to explore strategy around increasing our neurodiversity within the company. And so we saw that as an opportunity to make our company an interesting place to work, but also an opportunity to get better at what we do as a company by expanding the neurodiversity within our company. And it's something that it's worked. I think everybody likes working in an environment with different types of people. Companies like working with us for that reason. And it's been just a meaningful investment in our time to kind of make this a real part of our culture and our DNA.
That's great. And it sounds like it evolved very naturally from you, from your own experience growing up and kind of the way you were tuned in to differences in a very positive way. What, if any, has been the biggest challenge since you started working with Aspire and bringing in neurodiverse employees?
So, I'll give a pat on the back to Leslie and Aspire in that they're a wonderful organization, and they've helped us along the way. And we've also, of course, it's not like you can just lean on Aspire and they'll do everything, right? But they're a wonderful partner for any company that's interested in this space. It's the hardest thing, I think, is that Leslie said it earlier. There is no magic wand. It's not like you can tomorrow decide that you're going to have this as a part of your company. It's something that you need to have support, like Aspire, when questions come up. It's not a magic wand that makes everything work. It's putting in the time and making sure that you have the team in place to have the environment where it can be successful. And so the hardest part is, like anything, to make anything successful, it's patience, it's surrounding yourself with the right partners, it's doing a lot of reading. In my case, I was lucky to grow up with someone who was on the autism spectrum, and I've had life experiences in that world, but it's really getting a complete buy-in among the team and making sure that the team is working towards this together. And that's the hardest part. There's no magic wand. It's work, it's time, it's effort. And over the course of time, you can make it successful if you put in the work.
And was there any additional training that you provided, or even books you recommended to your team members?
Yeah. We have our head of HR and Leslie know each other quite well at this point. And early on, weekly check-ins. And so, we really had somebody on our team who wasn't me, because I wasn't the right person for it, because I probably was too close to, in addition to my brother and growing up with it, I've done a lot of philanthropy in the space. And so it's something that I needed other people to lead the charge on. It couldn't be a Dan initiative. So we had someone internally in our HR department who was tasked with this, worked with Leslie, read, had a lot of questions, and really worked with the team. And we also have a manager too who was assigned to it. So internally we put together a team to kind of work it. But Aspire, anyone who's in Massachusetts, start with Aspire as a resource. Leslie, apologize if I'm going to make your email too busy, but they're the best. And we certainly leaned on them, and they're able to pick up the phone anytime you have a question on what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. And so last question for you, and then Sydney, Leslie, you may have questions for Dan as well, or audience, those in the audience. What, from your teammates, from folks in your company, what have been biggest, best surprises maybe that you've heard from team members after you've hired interns?
I think I don't know if it's a surprise, but I think it could be categorized as a surprise. I mean, the best surprises have been that we've had people on our team have really meaningful, people that would be maybe aren't working out in other environments, living great lives right now with us. And that, I can measure that by, meaningfully employed, coming to all of our corporate events and, hanging out with the team, giving presentations to customers and clients that you never would have thought, or some of these people wouldn't have thought that they'd be comfortable giving. And I think the best part of it has been just some of the meaningful outcomes of taking people who were maybe junior employees, not because of neurodiversity, but just like, young people who maybe weren't finding meaningful employment and opportunities, and they're A players for us now. And what that does for those individuals and what that does for the team is just fantastic. And so I think that outcome is, it's just great. And that's not just neurodiversity. I think that's, diversity in general and yes, people in general. But it's certainly been something that's been really cool to see that we've had some people that might not be having the same level of success in other environments, just thriving in ours. And it's been just wonderful.
Well, that's fantastic. That's fantastic to hear. Thank you, Dan. Aaron, I noticed there's a question. Is that a question for Dan?
It is. We have a question from one of the audience members about, for Dan, about why intern positions rather than full-time positions right off the bat.
So we've why interns. So maybe there's a misunderstanding. We have done both internship programs with Aspire. So that's maybe where that question comes from is Aspire has a wonderful internship program, which is something that we've been a part of. But we've also done full-time positions right off the bat as well with individuals. So I don't think there's any difference in our hiring strategy around neurodiversity than there is around anything else. You know, we happen to have a really good resource for internship programs that through Aspire, but we've also hired people who come in you know, much more senior roles as well. So I think probably that's where that question's coming from, is internship programs through Aspire. And if I'm talking about internship programs, it's because we have an internship program with Aspire that's been great, but we would hire up and down the company, you know, as neurodiverse as possible.
That's great. And I think I had focused a bit on internships, so that misunderstanding may have come from me. So thank you for clarifying with that question and answer, Dan. Great. So, so Leslie, this is kind of a good lead in to talking about your work at Aspire, and maybe to give a bit of an overview of what Aspire, how that works.
Sure. So just a very brief overview that MGH Aspire is through Mass General Hospital, and we work with children, teens, and adults on the autism spectrum, but also with related profiles. So it easily transitioned as we continued to build out our programming into navigating the workforce. So we had, you know, children turn into teens, turn into adults. And so we started to work with transition aged, and then we created this internship program about 7 years ago with one employer, and now we have 70 employers, or about 70 employers in the greater Boston area, up to New Hampshire and down to Rhode Island. It's also expanded to provide consultation and training to employers or companies that really want to build that within as well. So not necessarily just taking interns through our internship program, but creating their own internship program or their own hiring practices. There are some companies, depending on where they're at, that are saying, you know, we want to just hire neurodiverse talent, and can you support us with this? And actually, we've been, I want to say, silver lining to COVID right now is that we've actually been able to work with a lot of companies remotely, so across the US as well, which is something we haven't had the opportunity with before. So a lot of our support is really working with the intern or employee and doing consultation and coaching and supporting them with navigating the workplace, with the language that they need to use to get what they need, as well as the social piece, as well as the employers. So thinking about management and colleagues, I really appreciate you mentioning that it's not just the manager, that it's the whole culture, and that's everyone is a part of that. And it's not just the manager that's supporting the individual, but there are so many components to making an inclusive environment. So we do a lot of work with workforce development as well, and have found really that a lot of the change is not in the individual who's neurodiverse, but rather the environment that needs to shift and adjust to make sure that it's inclusive of all different minds.
So along that, Leslie, what are some of the top recommendations you make to employers?
That's a great question. I think, you know, we think about the environment physically that they're in. I think, you know, one thing that has come up a lot, I know we're in a virtual world right now, so it's a little bit different because the individual can actually control their environment a whole lot more than when you're in the office. And there are a lot of open concept places right now that get to be louder. And so thinking about the sensory piece to that, having a quiet space, having a space to take a break, considering, you know, how somebody learns, if it's something where they need more written instruction than verbal, if they need time to process. So really there's a whole slew of recommendations, but the main point is understanding the individual and what they need. And even starting the conversation to understand, how do you learn best? What kind of feedback do you best respond to? Should I be explicit with this? Like really offering and opening up that conversation is not only showing that inclusivity, but you learn so much on how to be the best manager for that particular person.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that's great. And what feedback do you get from any memorable, I'm sure you have much memorable feedback from employers, especially if maybe worked with your program for the first time?
Yeah, so it's funny. I think that some of the feedback even comes from, so originally, you know, if we're pairing with a company with our internship program, we'll do a foundational training first, and even Dan's company is a part of that as well, where we'll meet with the team and talk to them a bit about autism, about ADHD, about the different learning profiles, the things that you might see and might notice, and understanding the person that you're going to be working with. And you have these aha moments where you're like, gosh, that's kind of like so-and-so on my team, or I really relate to that. And then by the end, when we're talking about, different things that you can put into place to really set up for a successful environment, really previewing, making sure that everybody knows exactly what's expected and what they're walking into, the feedback that we often get is, this would be really great for everyone.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
Right. And so it's not just for somebody who is neurodiverse.
Right.
It's actually thinking about the individuals that you work with. If you think even on your team, if you supervise a variety of different people, likely they have different learning styles, different personalities, and the same way that you manage doesn't work across the board. You have to shift and adjust things. Well, if you learn somebody and how they learn and what they need, and you're willing to be open to understanding what that entails, as far as, do you need to follow up a conversation with bulleted points as to what the expectations are, or check for clarity, or give instructions in a particular way, it helps them to be successful. And you get so much of that back, in recognizing the great strengths that they bring to the table. Sometimes, and just a kind of quick anecdote, we've had employers say, I'm trying to figure out their, great strengths, what I can put them on what project. They're between projects right now. So I ended up giving him, this deck that was 86 slides long that 12 people have looked over. I just figured, you look over to what's another set of eyes while I figure out something else. Lo and behold, this individual happened to have great attention to detail and recognized 36 just little errors that 12 other people hadn't noticed.
Wow.
An extra space, this number didn't match this one. And then suddenly, aha, the manager goes, I have so many things I need to put you on, and realize this great talent that he brought to the table. And so the only way you do that is perhaps changing and adjusting and saying, here are other projects you can consider working on, but also kind of diving in deep. What is it that you want to, that you're passionate about, that you're capable of? What's your skills and ability that we need to tap into to make sure that you also feel valued on this team? What are the things that we can help you to maximize while you're here? And what are some of the things that are growth areas or really challenges that you might have that we can help to support and manage with you? And I think that's a very different narrative than this idea of, oh, there are these deficits and this is what makes it really challenging. And that can oftentimes be something just in the hiring process that gets in the way. That's the barrier to even having that opportunity to begin with. So being able to be more open with understanding what a person is capable of doing rather than just how they present themselves is a huge piece of this as well.
Right, and very connected to what Sydney had talked about earlier in terms of the misconceptions and the stereotypes that create those barriers.
Right.
So I know we'll be hearing from Sydney in a moment. Just to pause, Erin, any questions for Leslie or for any of the panelists?
Yes, we have a question. In our company, we're seeing people self-identifying. How would you suggest presenting the need for this level of inclusion as a business need so that senior leaders see the value of investing in neurodiversity?
I think if you're starting to see that people are self-identifying, first of all, kudos to you. That's fantastic. That actually, in my mind, says that you're creating an inclusive enough environment where you have people coming and saying, so this is my learning style, this is who I am, this is my background, this is what I need. And coming back to say, okay, so how can we support you? What can we do internally? Is really promoting that, that neurodiversity is not only a positive and should be valued, but that it's something within the company and organization in general is going to be promoted and wanted, and really finding ways to support. So I think if that's coming up, that's awesome. You're already on your way. That's not necessarily the case. I think I might shift the answer a little bit just to say if that weren't coming up and you wanted it to, it would be having a really good discussion. I'd consider actually putting in like an introductory training to say this is something that we're really interested in building within our culture. And we need to start learning about where our own, implicit biases when it comes to this lie, and understanding how we can do better and what this means and how we can support one another. So it's really kind of making sure it's clear that that's a value within the company. And then on the individual basis, should somebody self-identify, or if you want to talk about it within a team, to say, you know, we're encouraging this because then we can better support you and manage you in your job and experience here.
Yeah. Yeah, and agreed completely, Leslie, to your point that how great that an individual could come forth in this organization to self-identify. Great, so that is a great lead in to Sydney. And what, oh yes, sorry. So before Sydney had suggested this poll of, does your company have either through an ERG group, DI, a designated neurodiversity community?
Just giving it a couple more seconds for folks to respond.
Yep.
Okay, it looks like we have a majority, so let's go ahead and
Great.
share those results.
Good. So how does that compare? Sydney, how does that compare to your experience with company DI groups around neurodiversity?
I think that sounds about right, Lisa. It's a very new concept, so seeing the no's, I'm not in the least bit dissuaded by that. I think especially at the corporate leadership level, it's diversity has always referred to race or sexuality or gender, and this whole idea of cognition is a newer concept. So I'm not the least bit dissuaded by that. I think getting those numbers up is definitely a goal, right? I think that's why we're all on the call, is we want to see more conversations like this one. So yeah, I think that sounds about right from my experience, but we definitely want to see higher numbers.
Great. So Sydney, would love to hear about your role at Red Hat in the neurodiversity ERG, and also this may be a big question, but how did that ERG come to be and become such a strong force at Red Hat?
Yeah, absolutely. So the neurodiversity group, we've been around at Red Hat for a little over 2 years. The first ERG, or diversity and inclusion group, as we call them at Red Hat, was BUILD, which is Black Leaderships United, and oh my goodness, I'm totally messing up the acronym, but it's definitely a minority group, and they kind of paved the way for other groups to create this petition process. So with that process in place, which started about 6 or 7 years ago, Neurodiversity kind of followed those guidelines. We petitioned our people team, which is like our name, Red Hat's name for HR. We got an executive sponsor, and we're eventually able to have budget to hold programming for our community members. It wasn't an easy path because, again, neurodiversity being such a new concept, there was a lot of education that needed to be done. It took about a year to get the group finalized and kind of officiated. But once we got there, we've really been working, as hard as we can to do things to continue that education, increase the awareness, and reduce the stigma. And that's kind of been our main focus, in addition with supporting hiring practices that support a more diverse workforce.
So it sounds like your group has quite a bit of input at Red Hat in terms of decision-making, programming. Can you give some examples about what you put together as a DI group for resources for neurodiversity?
For sure. One of the latest pieces of programming we partnered very closely with the Wake County. We're located in Raleigh, North Carolina, and Wake County National Alliance on Mental Illness is a close partner of us. And we frequently tap them for experts in different subject areas as our community kind of arises the need for them. So one of the most recent, we were seeing this outcry of grief in light of COVID-19, kind of this not this grief of someone passing, but that everyday sort of loss that people can feel. And so we put together a presentation with NAMI on how to best support associates while they were going through this. That was targeted at both leadership and also associates and what they could do for themselves to kind of work through these difficult feelings. We get into a situation a lot of times where we find ourselves advocating for wellness in addition to neurodiversity. I think Leslie said it best, that when we make these places safe for these like emotions and kind of advocate for these wellness, we're really doing it for everybody, and it only benefits you know, neurodiverse people as well as people who are neurotypical or identify as such. Another way we've influenced our people team policy is in hiring practices, just kind of bringing to light this huge gap we have. I mentioned earlier the measurability of self-identification, which is not something that Red Hat takes note of. And so that's something we're working with our teams to say, you know, this is an important demographic that is relevant and to you, leadership, and let's track this. Let's get a handle on what type of our workforce we have so that we can best meet the needs of those employees, make them feel safe, and let them bring their best selves to work.
Thank you. There's so much that you do. I know just from talking with you in the past and knowing about Red Hat. What advice would you have for employees that maybe at a company and they'd like to start a DI? What are some initial steps?
Absolutely. I love this question. I think that we want to see, just like the poll, we want to see more of these groups pop up. And so I think emails will be shared. I'm available as a resource. I'll just say that off the top. Anyone on the call, feel free to email. One of the biggest ways that the D&I group started was finding a network of allies who were like-minded. And that sort of happened very organically through people who were experiencing similar neuroatypical conditions, and talking about that in conversation and feeling safe enough to come forward to share those feelings with each other. Then that kind of snowballed into an organizing you know, factor. One of the great things we were able to start very early on is sort of a mental health chat. We've got a little bit over 400 members now. We're very proud of those numbers. And it's basically a place that is, the agreement going into this Google Hangouts chat is that it's a safe space for people to come forward with any sort of symptom that they're experiencing that day, or any sort of challenge that they're experiencing in the workplace, whether it be with like a manager or whether it be with another associate, and kind of get advice in a way that's very neutral. We do have HR people in the chat, and we walk this very fine line between providing advice and just kind of helping each other out. But building the community in that way has really been this beautiful exercise in empathy. And it really helps sell to executive leadership as well. That leadership buy-in is so important. That's really the final step. Once you kind of have your allies built and you know who your community is, that's when you can really start pitching to your HR teams. That's when you can start pitching to your executive leadership, find a sponsor, and then, you know, start thinking about budget and what you can really do. There's plenty of research out there that supports why hiring neurodiverse associates are great for organizations, and so tap all of those resources that you can.
Thank you. I was going to ask about leadership, so thank you for mentioning that, Sydney. Erin, just to check in if we have a question for Sydney, or again, any of the panelists?
We have a few different questions. Let's actually start with the one that came in most recently, which is specifically for Sydney, about how to find and reach out to the correct person to serve as an executive sponsor for a group like this.
That's a good question. We were very lucky to have a lot of people early on in the organization in the neurodiversity organization in one part of the organization at Red Hat. So it started pretty much in the IT organization within Red Hat. And so the executive sponsor was a natural fit. Our CTO was a natural fit for executive sponsorship. I would say if we needed to pave a road where there's not a natural fit, if someone needed to find a sponsor in a different way, I would say look for people who are sharing messages of vulnerability at a leadership level. We recently placed a global chair who posted a blog on opensource.com openly sharing his experience with anxiety, which isn't quite related to the definition on this call, but that experience of vulnerability and kind of opens the door to a little bit of empathy, which is so important to the work in neurodiversity. And that's kind of would be my advice on how to start that conversation, at least.
Thank you. That's great. Erin, was there another question as well?
We've got one. What can we do that's, I think, came out of what Leslie was talking about, but I think could be addressed by any panelists. What can we do to make training course materials delivered in our workplaces more neurodiverse, especially if they assume a, quote, normal, unquote, level of understanding, interactions, emotions, etc.? And then this person shared a personal experience where they were on an emotional intelligence course, which upset them, and asking the trainer, and when they asked the trainer if the course was ever tailored for people who were not neurotypical, they said, "What's that?"
Oh.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a new concept for many people. So the neurodiversity, or even the concept in general, is new. But I think when it comes to really adjusting training materials and making sure that it's something that works across the board, I would actually start with universal design and looking into having, even if it's a deck of slides, you want to have it's actually similar to what we see right now, where you have a really light background, you want to have dark text. That's something where there's a lot of resources just in general if you want to look it up, and I could have a further conversation offline about this as well. But oftentimes it's really making sure there's a lot spelled out, and it's not necessarily just images. It's great to have captions as well, so that you're making sure that people can read along with hearing the verbal piece. I would also make sure that you have a recording so you can send it to someone after, because of processing speed and just being able to focus for a certain period of time. So if you're able to pause and play, write notes if you need to, and then play again or rewind, that can be really supportive and inclusive as well. But I would certainly start with universal design options to just help everybody across the board.
If I could just add to what Leslie's saying, which is so great about how to make these materials accessible, I think something in the personal experience struck me that we really are being called upon to be ambassadors for neurodiversity. So when you, don't be discouraged if you come across people who haven't heard the phrase or don't know what neurotypical means. Look at it as an opportunity to educate and inform someone around what the real work is in this area, and extend, you know, a little empathy in the fact that this person just may not know, you know, it may not assume good intent, and they may not, it just may be a lack of knowledge or a lack of exposure, which is common when this term is so new.
Thank you, everyone. So, you know, we have about 5 minutes. So just to kind of move forward a bit, there's so much still to talk about. And certainly, as Sydney mentioned, emails will be shared at the end. So I've gotten permission from all 3 panelists to share emails. So if you have follow-up questions, thoughts, feel free to contact people. I'm sharing this, you know, we refer a lot at MindWise to Amy Edmondson's work around psychological safety. And it strikes me that so much of what all of you have talked about in terms of creating an inclusive workplace is very much about elements of building trust, open communication, really encouraging creativity, taking risks in terms of not only for the individual that's coming forth to self-identify, may not self-identify, but also having team members and leadership trained. And I really love, Sydney, that you focused on empathic responding and having accurate knowledge. We feel like we talk a lot about mental health in general, in the broad sense of behavioral health at MindWise, and it so overlaps with diversity, inclusion, and everything we're talking about. And that accurate information, knowing what the resources are, is so key. So we'll be talking more about this in our next session next week, as we also talk about financial stress and how leaders can address that. So my, I guess, last question to all of you would be around, in the few minutes we have left, how do you think about the way forward? What would be your hope, or what do you see is happening that feels positive, or what might be challenges in the way forward?
I think just for doing what you can to reduce stigma. I think that's a really big hurdle that we found when the people who did know about neurodiversity when we started our ERG had a lot of misconceptions. And I think just being willing to educate around those things and being willing to reduce the stigma around sharing openly to as you're mentioning these psychological safe spaces, let's make those spaces safe and walk the walk. That would be my advice and kind of the biggest challenge going forward.
I think just recognizing, to add on to what Sydney was saying, recognizing that every company and employer is in a different place, and that's okay. You don't need to have the entire company say, this is what we're doing and we're shifting everything and we've decided, you can start small. I think with the different companies that we've worked with, we've gone with one intern, or they create an entire program within house, or they're doing training across the board, or just in certain departments. So it really depends on, take the temperature of your company, see where you're at, and then start from there and see what kinds of change you can make over time. And looking at, time, change over time can add and continue to build. And I think that's really what we're starting to see with more companies, and the fact that this term is starting to be used more and more. It was so new, and now it's it's a part of conversation these days, which is great. So just seeing where you are and what you can incorporate, and starting from there, and continuing to build and making sure that you keep going with it.
Yeah, I would just add, I think a lot of companies have had the word neurodiversity in the workplace, and why we talk about it differently now. I think good companies have had this for a long time in their workforce, and I think now there's a term around it, and there's training and resources, and there's a better understanding of it and how to make it more successful, and to just make a deliberate effort. I think people that jumped on today's call are interested in it, and those are the types of steps that you take. It's not that neurodiversity and everybody didn't exist in companies 25 years ago. Really good companies have been good destinations for different types of thinking and people. And now we've been able to kind of box up some of this thinking around how to work with now neurodiverse groups and be more successful with it. So make that deliberate effort to leverage the resources that are out there now.
Thank you, Dan, for that reminder. That's a great call out to what's already been done and how it's helpful to have the language to talk about it. So some key takeaways here. This recording will be available to everyone that attended or that registered and weren't able to join us today. And in that you will have the information for email. A reminder that, as Tom mentioned, if you're interested in a behavioral health consultation to think about how to talk about inclusion, diversity, and mental health, again, very connected in your workplace, feel free to contact me about that. As promised, here are the emails. If you want to take a quick photo. Thank you so much for joining us today. Amazing group of individuals on the call. Thank you, Dan, Sydney, and Leslie for joining us. And have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lisa.